Well, here's the diaphragm. As you can see, I've got the blades splayed out, but they are firmly fixed. They don't come out of there. They've been riveted over. It's a bit of an odd construction. It's a very cheap construction, I would have said. Not one you'd expect on a quality camera. We've got this blade here with the bend in the tip. I'm not sure if I can get that. Oh yeah, looks like it's straightening up. Yeah, that's alright. They're very, very touchy, those blades. Right, so I've got to get this diaphragm back together. Basically, I've just got to interleave the blades, swing them back in towards the centre and get them all interleaved. Each blade should be under the next blade at one end and on top of the next blade at the other. They're not like shutter blades which are stacked in and there's a definite first and last blade. Let's get these swung in. They don't move freely. They're quite stiff. But they would have always been quite stiff. That's not a new fault. They'll have always been stiff. Right, you can see I'm pushing them into a circular shape there so that this thing will fit into the shutter. Right, so here's the case, and I've cleaned the case. I've got all the grease and rubbish out of that. There's a notch in the case here. Now that notch will engage with this tab. Alright, that's sitting in the case there. It's not sitting dead flat. Those blades must have to pull in a bit more from there. Let's do that. Just bringing them in a bit from the edge. Okay, and that plate sits down into a recess in the case. None of this is particularly flat. The piece that goes on there next is this piece. Now you can see it's got a notch out of one side here. Well, that must line up with this hole here in the case. So this goes on in here somehow. Let's pull those blades in a bit. This thing's cursed. It's not a nice piece of kit. Let's put all those blades in, remembering that the aperture on this only needs to come out to f3.5. The blades do not need to be opened up all the way. So yes, something like that, say. Now I want to get this piece on. Now if it's swung in that direction, that would close the diaphragm down. So swung in, so if it's in the other direction, this piece has jumped out of its socket again, has it? It has. There's a recess in the case, but that plate's not very flat. If moved in this direction, that would be fully open. Trying to get these blades evened out. This plate goes on around here somewhere. Does it go there? I'm trying to get the little pivot points seated in these slots, but it may be awkward. That's it pretty much. Now I'm just looking at this to see if I've got that in the right position, because I might be one notch round from where I should be. That looks right. That looks like it's in the closed down position, and it looks like that's fairly correct right there. Okay, so this lever needs to go back on. Now this was quite greasy. I'm just going to rub some pencil lead on here. Nothing in this diaphragm moves freely, so there's no need for this to move extra freely either. Just put a bit of pencil lead over that. Now the top of the shutter, let me have a look, because I'm looking at the camera body and I can see that the screw that locates at the bottom of the shutter, and that's at this side. So this is the bottom of the shutter. The bottom of the shutter has this tab on it. The top of the shutter has the arrow on it. So we know that this goes this way up. Much like that. So I'll see if I can get the two shoulder screws in position. This is a very crude shutter. All right. Okay. That seems to move okay. That moves through the range I would expect it to move. It's quite tight at the F16 end of its range. Let's tighten those screws up. Yeah, that screw's not going tight really. I think it's bloody stripping out. The other one's tightening up okay. If you get one of those shoulder screws that looks like it's stripping out, you can rivet it over. That screw looks like somebody might have already done that. Basically, you support the screw head underneath and then you just rivet that over with a small punch. That's not so loose I'd need to do that, but it's certainly something you might have to do. The reason you have problems like that is that this lever here is very thin, and so there's hardly any screw threads engaged in it. Alright, so that's our diaphragm, and that's not a wonderful movement, but now we know why it's not a wonderfully free movement. It's because of the design of the product. It's not that it has become faulty or that has a problem developed from old age, or that it's sticking together with dried lubricants. It's just a terrible design. You know, it's I don't know, if you said that the other one was a $50 shutter, this one would be a $10 shutter. You know, it's made to do a half useful job for 1/10 of the time and for 1/4 of the price. Okay, so that's our case and diaphragm back together. You can have a look at the mechanism plate now. The first thing I want to do with this is just clean it. I'm using Naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, and I can see oily looking rubbish coming off on that, so there's definitely some contamination there. This is the surface that would be up against the shutter blades, so it needs to be quite clean. This side, of course, is much worse. There's quite a bit of old grease and oil on here. Now some of that almost certainly would have been put there when the shutter was assembled to lubricate the moving parts, but a lot of it has not stayed where it was put, and what has stayed where it was put has lost its lubrication qualities, you might say. It's gathered up a lot of dust and dirt, and it would be more akin to a grinding paste now than a lubricant. So I've just got to get all this filth off here, and we can start putting the mechanism plate back together. Most of the filth and the dried grease and rubbish is around the centre here of the lens tube, and that's not going to affect much other than the control, because it just means that the speed control dial would be likely to be quite stiff in its action. I'm cleaning inside the lens tube here. Now, typically with a construction like this where you've got a lens tube, usually that ring in the bottom there would have been painted with matte black paint, just to reduce reflections coming back through the lens from bouncing back and causing flare problems, causing low contrast problems. They certainly haven't done that. So that would be certainly something that you could do to improve the performance of the lens and shutter system, would be to paint the inside of that bottom edge there with matte black paint. However, today I'm here to put this back together the way it came. That's looking much cleaner, I'm pleased with that. Now these levers here, I'm just going to see if I can move these two apart. I'll put a bit of naphtha on there, and basically what I'm hoping is that if there's any grease or rubbish in there, that it will dissolve the oil, it'll dissolve in the naphtha, and it'll blow away, because we don't want grease and other rubbish in there causing us problems. I don't think there really is a problem there. They seem to move freely enough, but old grease and oil, when it's between two very flat surfaces, particularly thin surfaces, it'll stick them together just like it was glue. That all looks good now. I'm pleased with the state of that. I'm looking around me to see if there's anything I should be fitting to that mechanism plate before I put the blades back in there. But to tell the truth, I don't really see anything that I would need to put back in there. Everything would go back in on top of the mechanism plate once it's in the shutter. So with that out the way, that brings us to our shutter blades. and these just need to be cleaned again with naphtha. They are a bit dirty looking, not especially oily, but just dirty. A design of shutter like this is quite simple, but those blades have a big surface area, as you can see, and that means that if there's any contamination, anything causing it to stick to the surface of either the mechanism plate or the case behind it, that those blades will tend to... Well, I just got cut off then because the camera battery was flat apparently, and that's life as we know it. And basically I was just saying about grease and oil on blades and the problem it causes. So here are our blades, all clean, ready to go back on. Now, I didn't take a great deal of notice about which one went where. I had a look at these to see if they're identical, and of course they're not. This one has got a little notch out there, and that shows that that blade sat in that position so that that cutout would clear there. Now, which blade was down on the mechanism plate from here? I can't really see any staining on them. Sometimes you can, so I don't think it really matters. Let's put this blade here. And its mate can go here. And now I want to put the case back over the top of that. Well, we know that this is the bottom of the shutter case where that stud comes through, because that locates this in the camera body. I don't know where the top of the shutter is, but probably it's right here. Now we can see the hole in the case here. That drops over that projection there, that brass bush. So let's just try lowering this case over onto that. That fitted down fairly well. Is it sitting down hard? It appears so. And the blades open and close quite nicely. So let's get our 3 screws back in that mechanism plate. As the countersunk head screw goes there. And the 2 longer screws will go here and here. There, there. Lift those 3 screws up. Check that the blades still move freely. They do. In fact, that's quite smooth action. That's very good. Bit of cotton there from the cotton bud. Let's get rid of that. What's up here on the lens tube thread? Okay, so what needs to go back in there next? Oh, questions. Is that beast there? Is that what held that shutter closed? I think it was. okay, is that the screw that held that down? That looks like it probably is. Alright, I'll just have to have a quick look at my pictures to remind myself of how that went. I was going to put this spring in place, which would go here, but I have to put the speed train in first before I can do that. So the speed train, I need to clean that. Now I'm having a look at this. It doesn't look too strange in its construction. I think I'll just put that in a jar of naphtha and clean that in the ultrasonic cleaner and lubricate that with some graphite powder afterwards. I think that's the best way to tackle that. It has one fairly strong looking spring in there that swings that moving arm across, and that's not likely to give us any problems at all. Some speed trains use a very fine, almost like a watch hairspring almost, to return one of the levers. Typically when you clean them with solvent, the solvent binds those coils together and the mechanism doesn't work right until you've dried it out completely. We'll have no such problem with this. Well, I have this back from the ultrasonic cleaner. It's just been cleaned in naphtha. It seems to move very smoothly and reliably. I'm going to lubricate this with some graphite powder before I put this back together. So I'll just tip some in here in a very orderly fashion. We'll try and see how this behaves. I'll just work this a few times. Let that graphite powder work in. It's running very smoothly. That spring is very strong, and that very strong spring means that this mechanism will work quite well. It's most speed trains have quite useless little springs in them, and they won't overcome minor problems like grit and dust. This one would probably be fairly robust. I'm just going to blow that excess graphite powder out. Alright, let's see if we can put this back in the shutter. Could fight a little bit, but let's see how we go. Yeah, that's seated. It's got a holes in the mechanism plate below it which take the screw heads holding this thing together, and so it locates very firmly in the mechanism plate. It means that there is no adjustment for speeds by moving this relative to the speed settings cam plate. Now at the other end here, we have this spring that needs to go in, and I can see that that's going to be awkward to get into there, but we need to achieve that. See if I can get this screw started without this spring Looking at this might actually be easier to get this on the mechanism plate before putting the mechanism plate into the case. How would I do that? Well, I've got access to the 3 screws that hold the mechanism plate into the case. I'm going to try that. Normally I would strip the mechanism plate completely and then assemble all the control components to the mechanism plate. Once the plate was back together with the case. But I know that at least one time with a different shutter I found that you could split the case and put it back together with most of the control stuff on the mechanism plate. So I think that's the case here. This certainly gives me access to getting that spring in, because I can put the screw in now with no tension and then swing it into position, which is something I would find very difficult to do if this was in the case. Make sure that spring's free to move around that shoulder. It is. And swing this spring around and hook it onto this lever, like that. Well, I couldn't have achieved that if that had been in the case. Alright, let's put the blades back on. This blade goes there. And its mate goes here. And now I'll put that back into the case. To line up that brass stud with that hole. Like that. And refit the 3 screws. Well, that's interesting. It's certainly very convenient being able to do that. With a lot of shutters, you have componentry stopping you from doing things like that because you have springs that bear against the inside of the case, so that you can't fit the control gear to the mechanism plate and then assemble it to the case. You have to add that stuff later. That screw's fallen out. Let's see if I can get that into the right position. Yeah, it looks possible. Okay, so our shutter is now strongly sprung loaded, as you can see, and it moves very freely. Our speed train, as you can hear, runs down smoothly in a very controlled fashion. And I think we can put a few other things back in the shutter. Our flash contact can go back in. That went there. I'm looking to see how that was, where it sat. Did that sit, in fact, sit there? No, it didn't. It sat there. This clamp plate, now it's got an extra little hole in it to help keep it in line. That went on there like that. And the screw held that all together. It's not lined up correctly. I'll get that screw in and then I'll twist it around until it's all aligned correctly, I think. Oh, so I can get the screw in easily. Whoops, not today. There's a tiny little stud on this plate. Has to pass through a hole in that contact and then align with a tiny hole in the case. Well, the flash contact has a significant amount of tension on it, and I can't get it aligned properly. Oh, hang on, we're on to something. Okay, so I've got the screw in. Let's tighten it up a bit, see if that plate falls into position. It looks like it might be. Yes, that looks correct. So if that's my flash contact, how does that work? Okay. So, as the blade's open, this thing comes across, it hits this contact, the moving contact, and that in turn hits the centre contact here on the flash connection. And this piece here just sits there as a stop to stop that prematurely doing anything. It's a very, very small gap between that flash contact there and this piece. I'm having trouble seeing whether it's actually making contact or not. I suppose I could connect an electronic flash up to it and see if it fires. I hope that this will take a normal flash contact. Now that fired immediately. Why did it do that? It might have just been while I was fitting it in position. Yeah, it's right now. I don't want to get jumped all the way across the room here, so let me just grab hold of this with insulated tools. This electronic flash I've got is an older one. It's probably got a high trigger voltage. I don't want to light myself up. Let's try this. Oh yeah, that'll fire the flash. Yep. So the flash contact works. That's good to know. What more do we need to be doing in here? Well, I've got the shutter release here that needs to go back in. Now this componentry here is riveted together. That spring's going to be fun to get in place. I don't know yet whether it's going to be more convenient to put this in on the plate before I get this in the case or not. But what I want to do is just flush this lever assembly out with a bit of naphtha and then lubricate that with a bit of graphite powder. I think there's I don't see a problem with it, but I just want to make sure that there's nothing sticky in there that will cause a problem. Just looking at that surface, it looks a bit grimy. I don't know whether there's anything on it. Those marks don't really come away much. I think actually that's fine to put back in just as it is. Now, we had this spring, and that was our release lever, which I'm fairly sure sat like that. There's a space underneath that the spring could sit. This lever sat there and this had to be flipped back underneath there. So, oh, this is a dangerous looking thing, this is. Seeing if I can get on the end of that spring and pull it over into place all right. Oh, that's a funny looking thing. Oh, it didn't sit there, did it? No. Must have sat there. This lever must have sat there. There's a screw that goes on the top of that lever. This lever went on there. And I've got to get that spring pulled round behind there. Okay, let me study this.